When you think of Air India, what comes to mind? You may picture a struggling state-owned airline with aging aircraft and subpar service. You may have seen them in the news because one of their planes just crashed. You probably don't have a great impression of them. Many people don't. And that's because the past 3 decades or so have been incredibly difficult for Air India. It has suffered from poor management, heightened competition, and ballooning debt levels that almost put it out of business before the Tata Group swooped in and saved it in 2021.
The public perception of this airline has drastically gone down over the last several years.
The tedious process of cost cutting for Air India continues.
Air India is in trouble, everyone knows that.
But Air India wasn't always a dumpster fire. In fact, for their first 40 or so odd years in business, they carried a tremendous amount of prestige in not only India, but all of Asia. They were known for their modern airplanes, luxurious cabins, and exceptional service. Their crews were rigorously trained and immaculately dressed. I mean, at one point, the first-class stewardesses were wearing extremely ornate Rajasthani costumes with silver jewelry that were believed to weigh up to 25 kgs. The point is, Air India took the passenger experience very seriously. There was an air about India, as the great Maharaja used to say. Today's world-class Asian airlines, Singapore and Cathay to name a couple, once looked up to Air India and aspired to reach Air India's standards. But shortly after its founder and chairman was fired by the government in 1978, Air India began to go downhill. It faced problems both of its own doing, like poor management and corruption, as well as problems outside of its control, like terrorist attacks and volatile fuel prices. We'll go into all of that in today's video, or perhaps split it into 2, 3, or maybe even 4, depending on how long it takes. But to understand the conditions that led to Air India's rise and fall, and potentially rise again, we have to rewind the clock back to 1929. At this time, India was still under British rule, although Gandhi's independence movement was well underway. Aviation was not on the minds of most Indians. There were just 4 civil aviation airports in the country, by my count: Juhu Aerodrome in Bombay, Willingdon Airfield in Delhi, Drig Road in Karachi, and Calcutta. If you wanted to fly commercially, you really had one choice, and that was Imperial Airways, a British airline that operated the DH-66 to Karachi, which was then part of the British India. Just one Indian man had his commercial pilot's license, and his name was Jehangir Ratanji Dadabhoy Tata. JRD, or just J as he was known, was the son of businessman Ratanji Tata, so he was born into one of India's wealthiest families. However, he wasn't just your average spoiled rich kid who had everything given to him on a silver platter. Jay was born and raised in France and served 1 year in the French army before being summoned back to India to join the family business as an unpaid apprentice. During his time in France, Jay developed a fascination with flight. He was inspired by the great Louis Blériot, the first man to cross the English Channel in an airplane. In fact, Blériot was neighbors with the Tatas. Much to Jay's delight, Blériot would often land his plane on the beach in front of the Tata's house. So when he made it back to India, he was determined to find a way to weave aviation into the family business. At first, it was difficult. Jay had to learn the ropes of Tata's core businesses first: steel, engineering, power, chemicals, and hospitality, to earn the trust and respect of Tata's then chairman, Sir Dhirab Tata. In 1930, the opportunity finally presented itself. An Englishman named Neville Vincent came to the Tatas with a proposal to start an airline, and JRD was able to convince his boss to give him 200,000 rupees to invest in the new venture. In 1932, Tata Air Services was born. Jay piloted the first flight himself from Karachi to Bombay via Ahmedabad. The plane was a de Havilland Puss Moth, a single-engine monoplane with just 2 seats. In its early days, Tata Air Services was a very ragtag operation. They operated out of a small thatched roof hut at Juhu Aerodrome, and they flew just freight because, as one man put it, no one was willing to pay 100 rupees to fly from Bombay to Karachi. Doesn't seem like a lot, but that was the equivalent of about $26, which in today's currency would be $600. When they did start offering passenger flights with the Miles Merlin, the passengers had to sit on top of the mailbags. The service was popular with both freight and passengers because it was one of the only services between Karachi and Madras. And Tata quickly developed a reputation for reliability and punctuality, A report from the DGCA in 1933 commended Tata for not delivering a single parcel late, even during the monsoon months. In 1936, Tata won an important contract with the British government, which is a huge financial boost. All first-class mail between Karachi and Colombo would be carried by Tata at ordinary postage rates. The revenues generated from this route alone allowed them to subsidize new aircraft and new routes. And that's exactly what they did. By the 1939-1940 timeframe, pre-World War II, Tata Air Services, now called Tata Airlines, was operating a fleet of 8 passenger aircraft, consisting of the de Havilland Dragon Rapide, de Havilland Express, and Waco YQC. You could now fly with Tata to 15 destinations across India, from Delhi to Goa to Hyderabad. Jay and his lieutenant, Neville Vincent, had big ambitions to continue growing the young carrier, but the onset of World War II sort of threw a wrench in their plans. During World War II, Tata's operation was taken over by the British government. They weren't able to grow their route network, but demand on existing routes remains relatively strong, so they were able to upgrade their fleet. Though there wasn't much fighting in India, the country served as a vast garrison and supply ground for the war against the Japanese. More than 2 million Indians fought for the British Army, and those troops needed transport. Tata stepped in to help the Royal Air Force in that regard, as well as with other wartime endeavors such as supply shipments and aircraft maintenance. Jay and Neville also drew up a scheme to manufacture aircraft in India, launching a new subsidiary called Tata Aircraft. They acquired land, built a factory, hired workers, and they were all ready to go. But in 1942, Neville Vincent's plane was shot down off the coast of France, and the project was ultimately called off. It was a devastating blow, but Jay had to march on. After the war, passenger air services were becoming more common, but so was competition. There were 2 other carriers that had domestic route networks rivaling that of Tata, Indian Airways and Air Services of India. Tata wanted to differentiate by expanding to Europe. He envisioned a much bigger global airline that would be a source of pride for the Indian people. Reflecting this vision, he renamed the company Air India, after polling his employees, of course, and he took it public in 1946. Now remember, this is a period of immense political change and turmoil. India became independent from Great Britain in 1947, but the conflict was far from over. The partition of India and Pakistan set off communal violence and displaced millions. Many Muslims no longer felt safe in Delhi, and many Hindus and Sikhs no longer felt safe in Karachi. Tata, of course, wanted Air India to be accessible to all Indians and Pakistanis, regardless of religion, but he ultimately had to align with one of the governments. India was the logical choice given the airline was based in Bombay and the majority of its operations were conducted outside of Pakistan. So he lobbied the Nehru government on a service to Europe. He wanted the government's approval, but he also needed capital. So he drew up a deal whereby the government would purchase 49% of the airline, with the option to take majority control at a later date. Air India thus became the country's first joint public-private partnership, and 2 years later they launched services to London. The flight was operated by a Lockheed Constellation named the Malabar Princess, and it took more than 48 hours, stopping in Cairo and Geneva. Tata himself was aboard the flight, along with 34 other passengers. Fares started at 1,720 rupees one way, equal to 129 pounds sterling. In today's currency, that works out to a whopping 4,000 pounds. Initially, the flight only operated once weekly, but it was popular because it was the fastest and arguably most luxurious way to London. BOAC, the predecessor to British Airways, also operated the route, but their service stopped in Karachi, Basra, Cairo, and Tripoli and took almost 2 full days. Competition heated up significantly over the coming years into the early 50s, but Air India fought back with some of the most brilliant marketing commercial aviation has ever seen. At the center of it all was the Maharaja, which is Hindi for emperor. The Maharaja was a symbol of luxury and hospitality, and he was often seen bowing in courtesy, but according to his creator, Bobby Kuka, his blood wasn't blue. He wasn't really royal. He was funny, irreverent, and always up to something. He was a lover boy in Rome, a sumo wrestler in Tokyo, and he was once even seen rescuing a mermaid on a beach in Sydney. But perhaps the most genius one of all was when he swapped roles with the Mona Lisa in Paris. Probably offended a couple Parisians, but to everyone else, including myself, it seems like the perfect blend of style and humor. Air India was teaching a masterclass in advertising, and it was night and day compared to BOAC's advertising at the time. All they could manage was a picture of a smiling flight attendant along with the slogan, "BOAC takes good care of you." Now, sadly, Air India's creativity wouldn't last forever, but we'll cover that when we get to the 70s. The early 50s was a trying time for Indian Airlines, especially domestically. The surplus of cheap aircraft post-World War II gave rise to 9 different airlines in the Indian market, and there was way too much capacity. In 1953, the Nehru government nationalized India's airlines, creating one airline for domestic services and one airline for international services. Tata was put in charge of the international airline, now called Air India International, while Air India's domestic operations were merged into the newly created Indian Airlines Corporation. Now, I know what you guys are thinking. Nationalization can't be good. Governments are usually poor stewards of airlines, and you're right. But in this instance, the government took a fairly hands-off approach, allowing Tata to call all the shots at Air India International, and he even had a seat on the board of directors at the newly formed Indian Airlines. Even though Tata now had the financial backing of the government, he still wanted to hold the airline to high standards in terms of quality and efficiency. As such, he was very careful and deliberate in his expansion plans. In Europe, he continued to focus on London, but added a few new stops along the way, notably Paris, Rome, Dusseldorf, Prague, and Zurich. In Africa, he launched service to Nairobi to tap into strong Indian business demand to and from Kenya. And in Asia, he flew to Singapore, Hong Kong, Bangkok, and Tokyo. Australia even came into the picture, so by 1960, Air India flew to pretty much everywhere except the Americas. But that was soon to change. In 1960, Air India welcomed its first Boeing 707, becoming the first Asian airline to enter the jet age. Shortly thereafter, they launched service to New York. Flight 111 would leave Bombay at 1 a.m. local on Saturdays and get into New York at 2:30 p.m. that same day, stopping in Beirut, Zurich, Paris, and London. Interestingly, passengers could book just the New York to London segment, and many did, because Air India's service was on another level. Passengers in first class were pampered with 6 courses and the finest cocktails. Economy passengers didn't receive quite the same treatment, but even they got a whole-boned rock Cornish game hen. I mean, what? Air India's Maharaja Lounge in London put TWA and Pan Am to shame. The curtains were made of Indian raw silk, while the walls and tables were ordained with ancient Gujarati carvings and brasswork. It was small, with seating for just 18 passengers, but it made a statement. Air India had a good reputation, but they were still small with under 20 planes, and international competition was intense on many of the routes they operated. To help combat this competition, J. Tata teamed up with BOAC and Qantas in what he called the tripartite partnership. It was basically a revenue share agreement where each carrier would split the revenues in proportion to the capacity they operated on certain routes. I imagine it being very similar to the transatlantic joint venture American and British Airways operate today, or Delta Virgin Atlantic on the same route. In Air India's case, this partnership allowed them to pursue 2 important tasks simultaneously: the addition of New York as a destination, and the rollout of new 707s across its existing network. According to Bobby Kuka, they would have had to delay New York by at least a year if they didn't have the partnership in place. At any rate, by 1962, Air India International had retired all their Super Connies, meaning they were a 100% jet airline, the first commercial carrier in the world to operate exclusively jet aircraft. This milestone coincided with Air India's 30th anniversary, a sentimental occasion for Mr. Tata as well as many of his employees, who had been with him for decades. It was pretty crazy how far they'd come. In 1932, Tata himself was flying a plane made out of cloth and wood without radios or paved runways, and 30 years later, he was running a global enterprise with 6,000 employees. Air India now flew a fleet of the world's most modern passenger jets to 5 continents. They had 77 offices in 21 different countries, and in 1961 they were generating 22 crore in revenue. That's almost 2,000 crore today, worth about $227 million. What's more impressive, though, is that they were profitable. In 1961, they recorded a profit of 39 lakhs, worth 34 crore today, or $4 million. Doesn't seem like a lot, but keep in mind they only had 11 planes, so they were a fraction of the size of their European and North American counterparts. Additionally, they were still technically government-run. Other government-run airlines that had considerably more scale, like BOAC, Air France, KLM, and Lufthansa, all posted losses in 1962. Instead of draining the government's cash balances, Air India was adding to it. In 1963, J. Tata presented the Indian Minister of Transport with a check for 66 lakhs, worth $1.4 million at the time. It was a dividend, tangible proof of the company's health, and it reassured the government that their hands-off approach was working. Mr. Tata, not one to take anything for granted, expressed his gratitude with the following statement: "We are most grateful to the government for their enlightened and generous policy towards Air India and for giving us not only the necessary financial support, but also the freedom of action and decision which is so necessary in the conduct of commercial organization." Remember those words, because in the coming years, the relationship between the government and Mr. Tata would fracture. Air India, once known for their innovation and progress, would stagnate and regress, falling behind its competitors and draining the pockets of the government, along with Indian taxpayers. But we'll save all that drama for part 2, so make sure you stick around. In the meantime, if you want to connect with me for any reason at all, whether that be to ask a question, share an aviation-related insight, or to call me out for something I got wrong, please do. All you need to do is head on over to my website and fill out the form, and I'll try my best to reach out. We've gotten some really cool responses so far, and I've learned a ton from you guys. For example, Air New Guinea. Who knew Papua New Guinea had a national airline? And who knew they're supposed to take delivery of 2 787s next year? And of course, as a token of my appreciation, everyone who fills out the form will be entered to win a $50 gift card to the airline of their choosing. We've got a drawing coming up at the end of June, so that's 2 days from now, and probably at the end of July as well. But I digress. Thanks again for joining me today, and I wish you the safest and happiest of travels wherever your journeys may take you. So long.